In the opening lines of the hit musical Hamilton, they mention a forgotten spot in the Caribbean. This forgotten spot is the island of Nevis. Join me today as we briefly talk about the fascinating history of this island and its connection to Alexander Hamilton, Horatio Nelson, the start of slavery in Louisiana, and even the King of England. Hi, and welcome to Footnoting History. I'm your host, Jessica, and today we're going to be talking about the history of the island of Nevis. Now, before we jump in, I did want to introduce myself. I'm new to the Footnoting History team. I'm an archaeologist and historian. I've been working in this field for almost 2 decades, and I'm very excited to be a part of the Footnoting History family. Nevis is a small island in the Lesser Antilles. It's part of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. It's essentially a circle with one main road ringing around the island with a dormant volcano in its center. The island today is littered with archaeological remains of sugar plantations, and hints of the past are everywhere. From large ruins of sugar mills to the bridges that enslaved people crossed, there is not a place that you can step on this island that is not dripping in history. If you stand on the waterfront of the main town in Charlestown today, it might be hard to imagine this island as a bustling port with giant characters from our past, but that is exactly the case. Our story starts not with Alexander Hamilton or Horatio Nelson, but like many stories of colonization, with Christopher Columbus. He didn't land on the island of Nevis, instead choosing to land at its sister island, St. Kitts, just a few miles north. He lands there in 1493, and this gives us the first documentation in the colonial world of this small island in the Lesser Antilles. It's unclear exactly what happened to the thousands of native inhabitants who were living on the island of Nevis prior to colonization, but we can imagine Columbus spotting the island as the first domino, followed by many, including a visit from Sir Francis Drake, and finally the British formally colonizing the island in 1628. Likely, the native Caribbean people were impacted by illness, enslavement, and violence. Like most islands in the Caribbean, there was often contention with the Spanish, who destroyed English and French colonies and deported settlers back to their respective countries, only for those same countries and settlers to return and retake the islands over and over again. By 1698, Nevis is the wealthiest of the English Leeward Islands, mostly for its production of high-quality sugar. Sugar at this point in history is so valuable that it's almost looked at like white gold. Nevis even outranks larger islands like Jamaica in its sugar production, earning the nickname the Queen of the Caribs. And of course, the sugar production is driven by the labor of enslaved people. While the point of the story isn't sugar, sugar is definitely a main character pulling the strings in the background. It explains why all of this is happening on this island and across the Caribbean. Sugar is a labor-intensive industry. It requires a lot of work and a vast amount of space to be economical. First, entire sections of this volcanic island needed to be cleared to create sugarcane fields. Climbing on Nevis isn't like walking across a wheat field in the central United States. This is a volcano. There are deep gorges and ravines, and the topography of the island is anything but flat. And yet, enslaved people cleared this land and planted on the flat parts of the island as well as the slopes and in the ravines. Sugar took a lot of effort to take it from cane to the granular sugar that you might have at your kitchen table. Harvesting sugarcane without industrial equipment is incredibly difficult and labor intensive. Sugarcane grows kind of like bamboo. It's hard and stalk-like. Then it had to be crushed and boiled. Imagine boiling a vat of sugar as large as a small car in the summer heat of a Caribbean day. In addition, there are few naturally occurring water springs on the island. It does rain almost every day, but this water has to be collected. So, in addition to the massive amounts of infrastructure required just to produce sugar, there also had to be huge cisterns around the island to collect water to support this crop and the people who were living there. Once the sugar was boiled down to molasses, it could be milled, and that happened at different locations across the island. So it needed to be transported up and down these massive hills on this mountainside before it could ever make it to the port to be exported. Having worked on the island of Nevis myself, I can tell you that there is often no breeze or fresh air despite it being an island surrounded by the ocean. And while historians have mostly debunked the idea of a neat triangle when talking about the triangle trade of rum, sugar, and enslaved people, If anywhere was going to be an example of the triangle trade, it would be Nevis. In a lot of ways, this tiny island is the empire in miniature. You've got piracy, you've got war, you've got money moving in and out all the time. A small, wealthy white planter elite controls the entire island, while the majority of the island, up to 90% of the 10,000 people living on the island, are enslaved. And both Alexander Hamilton's family and the family of the future wife of Horatio Nelson are members of this white planter class. To understand the scale at which this white planter class is planting sugar on this island, we can look at the ecology of the island today. There are currently almost no native plants still on the island. With the exception of the very top of that central volcano, the entire island was once being cultivated for sugar. The vast wealth required the English government to take a heavier hand in the administration and logistics of the island. And so between 1675 and 1730, Nevis also served as the headquarters for the transatlantic slave trade of the Leeward Islands. It's estimated 6,000 to 7,000 enslaved Africans passed through Nevis every year during this period. The island served as a sort of way station for ships heading to other islands and locations in North America. And the crown, wanting to collect its taxes on its many industries, used this specific location to monitor the comings and goings of ships between the Americas and Europe. In addition to this administrative control, the British Crown also increased the naval power in the area. That meant issuing more writs of piracy. Now, these certificates of piracy were not specifically for the protection of the island of Nevis, but for all of the British colonies. And the British were not the only ones using piracy as a means of naval sea control. However, in 1706, Pierre Lamont d'Urberville, a French Canadian and the founder of what would be the U.S. state of Louisiana, decided to drive the English out of Nevis, and in doing so, to stop pirate attacks on French ships. For some reason, he considered Nevis the region's headquarters for piracy against French trade. During d'Urberville's invasion of Nevis, French buccaneers were used in the front line. French buccaneers had become infamous during this period for being ruthless killers after they pillaged, murdered, and tortured non-combatants during the wars with Spain. In the face of the invading force, the English militiamen of Nevis fled. Some plantation owners even burned down their own plantations rather than letting the French have them, and then went to proceed to hide in the mountains. It was the enslaved Africans who held the French at bay, taking up arms to defend their families and the island. They defended the island even while the slave quarters were being looted and burned. Part of the reason that the fighting was so fierce was that d'Urberville, as a reward, had promised the fighting men on the French side the right to capture as many enslaved people as possible for the purpose of reselling them in Martinique. During the fighting, approximately 3,400 enslaved Nevisians were captured and sent off to Martinique. About 1,000 more, poorly armed and military untrained, held the French troops at bay by what eyewitness English militiamen called murderous fire. It was written that the slaves' brave behavior and defiance there shamed what some of their masters did, and they did not shrink to tell us so. After 18 days of fighting, the French were driven off the island. Among the Nevisian men, women, and children carried away on the French ships, 6 ended up in Louisiana, and these were the first people of African descent to arrive there. One consequence of this French attack was the temporary collapse of the sugar industry. While Nevis continued to be a seat of control and wealthy plantation colony for the British Crown, this was the first major crack in its facade. It took time for the industry and the population to rebound after this attack, and plantations had to give up small tracts of land for enslaved people to grow some of their own food so they didn't starve to death. By 1730, Nevis was no longer the seat of British power in the Caribbean. Instead, it tried to maintain relevance by remaining a place of naval power and by continuing its sugar cultivation practices. And these are the conditions in which Hamilton's mother arrives on the island of Nevis around 1755. Rachel Fossett Buck had fled an abusive marriage prior to her relationship with Alexander's father and his birth. In fleeing her abusive marriage to an older man, the act of her leaving left her previous husband absolutely enraged. He was determined to humiliate and ruin her. So, seizing upon Danish law, he was allowed to jail his wife if he found she was guilty of adultery, or if she just no longer resided with him. So he had her imprisoned in the local fort, which doubled as the town jail. She was there for quite some time, but once freed, she left the Dutch colony and moved to St. Kitts, where she met a Scottish trader named James Hamilton, Alexander's biological father, and they relocated across the channel to Nevis. James's brother had a thriving, profitable sugar plantation known as the Hamilton Estate on the island of Nevis. And here is where Alexander was born. Now, we don't know if he was born in 1755 or 1757, the records are unclear. But we do have to wonder how much of what Hamilton saw and experienced on the island of Nevis shaped his later thoughts and development. He witnessed both extreme wealth and luxury of the upper white planter class and the poverty, horror, and violence endured by enslaved people. He was not wealthy. He was related to wealthy people. And so he lived in a different kind of poverty, a stratum of society that becomes relevant to his later writings. Eventually, Alexander's parents' relationship also fails. Not feeling the sense of loyalty or honor that would become prevalent later in this story and in the Georgian era, his father abandons the family. Historians don't know what the relationship between the two Hamilton brothers was like, but it appears that James Hamilton did not particularly care to finance or protect Alexander and his mother after their father's departure. The musical gives us an image of Alexander as an entrepreneurial youth who is driven by knowledge, and this might be true, but he also was likely very observant, and being in Charlestown would have been exposed to the ledgers, cargoes, ship watching, and all of the other things that were going on with finance. This is why when him and his mother move at the age of either 7 or 11 from Nevis to St. Croix, he's able to take a job as a clerk. And we don't know much more about this period for many reasons. But there's two big events that deeply connect Alexander and Horatio Nelson that are likely the cause. The first is the American Revolution, and the second is an extremely large hurricane that hit this part of the Caribbean in 1780. The American Revolution might have felt far away from the island, but it dramatically affected the Caribbean. When everything depends on shipping, shifting trade routes, convoys being attacked, privateers everywhere, and changing alliances have a big impact on small island nations. The revolution impacted Nevis so deeply that people began to starve on the island, and areas designated for sugar cultivation were once again put to the side in an attempt to grow crops to feed people on the island. Just as the area was beginning to recover from the impacts of the revolution, another disaster hits. And this one was much more unexpected. In 1780, one of the largest hurricanes to ever hit the Lesser Antilles made landfall. Imagine dark skies, crops flattened, ships wrecked, and an impact for people already on the edge of starvation. The formal tracking of hurricanes began in 1851, so this hurricane is not included in that data. However, when we look at the data collected after 1851, we see a pattern emerge of a major hurricane hitting the Lesser Antilles about once every 20 years. With that being said, a hurricane of this size and duration lasting almost 10 days would have been completely devastating to the people of the region, and a hurricane of this size had not been recorded or experienced before. The constant upheaval and strategic importance is why there was then a military presence on the island of Nevis. And this is where our second character, Horatio Nelson, enters the scene. You can imagine a young naval officer with thoughts of an ambitious career would not be particularly happy to be stationed in a far-off outpost as Nevis might be considered. And when he arrives in Nevis, he's not yet the hero of Trafalgar that we know today. As a young British naval officer, he gets to be a part of the local social class, and while 90% of the inhabitants of the island are enslaved people, the 10% of the rich white class have a diversity of stations. There are plantations that are doing better than others, some families have more political power, and there's also a lot of posturing. You don't want your neighbors to know that your wealth is failing or that you have less money than they might imply. As Nelson enters this social scene on the island of Nevis, he's introduced to the woman who will one day become his wife, Fanny Nesbitt. If Hamilton's mother had been completely destroyed by the failures of her previous marriage, Fanny was the opposite. Born in Nevis in 1761, her mother died when she was just 2 years old, giving birth to a son. Her brother was soon sent to England, as was tradition for the sons of governors and plantation owners, and Fanny became her father's constant companion. Fanny received an excellent education. She was accomplished in French, painting, drawing. She played the harpsichord, was an accomplished singer and dancer. Basically, she'd done everything that she needed to do to gain an attractive and successful husband. There were several young bachelors on the island to whom she was attracted, but when her father died in 1779 of a fatal cause of lockjaw, she fell in love with his doctor, Josiah Nesbitt, and they soon married. When her husband became ill just 6 months into their marriage, they decided to go to England as no one could figure out the cause or a cure for his illness. And in May of 1781, she gave birth to their son, also named Josiah. By October, her first husband was dead. And so in the space of 2 years, Fanny lost her father, was married, gave birth, and then became a widow. Upon hearing this news, her uncle, who was the president of Nevis, insisted that she return to the island and live with him at Montpelier, his plantation. So now, at the ripe old age of 22, the young mother and widow returned. 3 years later, Captain Horatio Nelson arrived at the Leeward Islands as a senior officer of His Majesty's Navy. Nelson was second in command to Sir Richard Hughes, but the two did not get along. Sir Richard lived in Barbados and spent more time at his home than he did on board any of the ships he was in charge of. Nelson loved the rules, and when he found out that Sir Richard Hughes had been turning a blind eye to certain regulations designed to protect English shipping, but that were basically impossible to enforce, he mounted protest after protest all the way up to the Admiralty in England. Eventually, he seized 4 American merchant ships that had refused to depart from Nevisian waters, and the islanders were furious. This was a direct threat to their livelihood, and so they collected money to enable the owners of those ships to sue Nelson for assault and wrongful arrest. Many people were still suffering from the effects of the American Revolution and the hurricane, and this was a further impediment to their livelihoods and the reputation of their island. During the court case, Nelson could not leave his ship for nearly 2 months. To do so would have meant being thrown into jail. Eventually, he did win his court case, but it made him very disliked on the island of Nevis, especially with the merchant class. He was basically barred from the society in which he'd been accustomed to participating in. He couldn't visit any of the wealthy planters' house, with the exception of Montpelier, the home of Franny Nesbitt's uncle, John Herbert, the president of the island. It seems that in the beginning, the couple really did have a real affection for each other. When Nelson asked for her hand in marriage, her uncle agreed. It's hard to say if the couple was actually in love or not before the engagement was official. Fanny's uncle had offered an incredibly large dowry in exchange for her hand in marriage. His condition was that they waited until his estate and affairs were in order so that he could retire to London. But both Herbert and Nesbitt concealed the fact that their famed riches were largely a fiction. And Fanny also did not disclose to Nelson that she was infertile due to a previous womb infection. Once they were engaged, Herbert offered Nelson nowhere near the dowry he had initially proposed. But this was the Georgian era, and breaking a marital engagement was seen as incredibly dishonorable. And Nelson, the young, ambitious naval officer, wanted to avoid any hint of dishonor or any more tarnish to his reputation. So on the 11th of March, 1787, shortly before the end of his tour of duty, he did in fact marry Fanny. And this wedding was a big deal. The perceived incredibly wealthy member of a planter family on one of the supposedly most prosperous islands in the Crown's holdings marrying a prominent naval officer is news. It appeared in magazines. And in fact, Prince William Henry, the future King William IV, attended the wedding in person and gave the bride away. He was serving under Nelson at the time, but royalty attending the wedding caused it to make headlines. Upon marrying Fanny, Nelson also becomes a stepfather to her 7-year-old son. And then, in July, just a few short months after their marriage, he returns to England and she follows, never to return to the island. Now, their marriage is contentious and full of betrayal, heartbreak, and affairs, but that is a story for another episode. Today, when you rock around Nevis, it can feel like a quiet, out-of-the-way island, more beaches and breeze than battles and revolutions. But the traces of these stories are still there. You can stand in Charlestown at the Museum of Nevisian History and the Alexander Hamilton exhibit on the site of his birthplace and follow quite literally in the footsteps of a boy who would help invent a nation's financial system. You can also drive up into the hills to Montpelier, now a small hotel, and stand near the spot where a young, not yet famous Horatio Nelson married Fanny Nesbitt, where Prince William Henry, the future king, was there to give the bride away. The same slopes that once held sugarcane and heard the crack of whips is now mostly dense jungle. And what ties all of this together is that Nevis, this forgotten spot in the Caribbean, was never actually forgotten. It sat right in the middle of an empire built on sugar and slavery, a place where enslaved people fought off invasion, where a future revolutionary thinker learned to read the ledgers of global trade, and where a young naval officer tried to navigate honor, ambition, and marriage in a collapsing plantation world. So the next time you hear the opening lines of Hamilton or see Nelson's column on the postcard from London, remember, their stories don't just belong to New York or Trafalgar, they belong to Nevis, to its volcanoes, its harbors, its ruins, and to the thousands of people, enslaved and free, whose lives made those great men possible. This has been Footnoting History, and if you like the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you for listening, and remember, the best stories are in the footnotes.